here tonight. And first off, I really want to thank Qualcomm and Rick and Dr. Jacobs for hosting us tonight. I think everybody should give them a round of applause. I'm Amy Romaker, and I'm the chapter chair of the MIT Enterprise Forum. And, you know, it's really special tonight because tonight is my last program. I am turning over the chair to Chris Steinhardt, who you'll meet later on up there. We'll be in very good hands, but this is a good hurrah for me to go out on, and I really appreciate that opportunity. This event is a culmination of a lot of hard work, and I'm pointing right at this person right over here, Ann Kerr, and of course, Dr. Cerf, and our board member, Tyler Orion, and our executive director, Anita Rush. On behalf of the forum, I want to thank you for allowing us to be part of your special program here in San Diego, Surf's Up in San Diego. We are honored to have this as one of our special programs, and we hope that you'll join us for other programs in the future where we highlight burgeoning technologies in San Diego and do corporate case studies. So we're always looking for good clients for case studies for our programs. And with that, I'm just going to introduce Ann Kerr. And thank you again.
Amy is too modest. They have done an incredible job of coordinating what is probably not a typical meeting in this town or probably anywhere. It's sort of kind of like this. There's a program called Survivor. Okay, so I think Vint could probably manage that quite well. So this meeting is called Surf's Up in San Diego. It's been going on now for 2 days. And Vint and I have collaborated on various things for more years than I'm going to admit to, because we started very young. But the meeting itself, you can't see the date, started the 28th and the 29th, and tomorrow morning there's one more session. The purpose was to entice Dr. Cerf to come out and see how much San Diego has to offer, that he can get out of the Bay Area, get out of Google Mountain View, and he's actually in the Washington area. Come out here and get exposed to our culture, our lifestyle, our people. So the meeting was a combination of academics, university, both universities, industry, individuals, anybody with something interesting to say. We also had a couple of writers there. So we put him through a crucible of roundtables of between 12 and 15 people, changing audiences, no PowerPoints, sitting around a table, having cross-cutting discussions, and he has managed magnificently not only just knowledge acquisition, interpretation, understanding, and now he's going to give you the benefit of his brain and all the good work that's been done. Before I turn it over to Dr. Cerf, I'd like to thank some very important people. First of all, Rick Valencia for allowing us to have this wonderful space with terrific acoustics. And then special thanks to Tyler Orion, Mike Kren, Rupert von Butler. I came to them with this crazy idea in the fall and said, gee, this is what I'd like to do. You want to get on board? And they just jumped right in. So, and Chris Steinhardt, who's been indoctrinated as the next round back there at the auditorium, was also wonderful. You can read these slides, but the members of the community jumped in as well. Jean Ray, Eric Otterson, Dave Titus. I'm not going to read them all, but everything from funders to technology. So with that, I want to turn over to Dr. Jacobs, who will be giving you more information about Vint.
Well, it is great to have Vint down here in San Diego. I was trying to think the first time that we had met, and my memory is not so good any longer, and so I can't really trace it back. But I think the early interactions we had to do in the early days of the ARPANET. When we started Linkabit, we applied to DARPA competed for a contract to extend the ARPANET over to Europe, and would do so by satellite. And we luckily won that contract and went ahead to build the Atlantic Packet Satellite Network. There were a lot of interesting things along the way that we bumped into. Bob Kahn, who with Vint was the other inventor or developer, or whatever one wished, of the internet protocol, went over with me at the beginning of the project because we wanted to identify some PTT, some telephone companies over in Europe with whom we could work. And we did get invited to 3 or 4 of them. And all I remember really is we'd go in, have a little bit of a technical discussion, have a great lunch, and then be shown the door. Because why would packet communications be of interest to any of them? So luckily we did end up getting some work with government laboratories and some of the universities, and the project did go ahead. That was interesting because and I have trouble keeping my decade straight here, I think it was 1977, we put together the ARPANET, the Atlantic Packet Satellite Network, and a packet radio network to first exercise the internet protocol. And that was the first time actually packets had gone back and forth across multiple networks, which none of us thought about too much at the time. And by the way, if you remember the term, the worldwide wait, I think it was, this was much more waiting. They were pretty slow making the packets move around, but it all did work and nothing fell on its face. And so nobody really thought too much about it until in 2007, I'm not quite sure how it did happen, the Computer History Museum threw a anniversary celebration for the 30th anniversary of the first use of the internet protocol, and we all got together again. And so that was probably going back to some of the early times that we had a chance to interact. Since then, there have been many others, and Vint, of course, is involved very much with the Marconi Society, and so we've had additional contacts there. So it is great to welcome you here to San Diego. Let me just read a little bit of the formal introduction, if you forgive me. Vint is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, contributes to global policy development and continued spread of the internet. It's hard to imagine where it's going to spread too much further, but Internet of Things coming. Widely known as one of the fathers of the internet, Vint is a co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the internet, served in executive positions at MCI, where again we had contact, the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, Defense DARPA, and faculty of Stanford. He also served as chairman of the board of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, from 2000 to 2007. Has been a visiting scientist at JPL since '98. Served as the founding president of the Internet Society, ISOC, from '92 to '95. Foreign member of the British Royal Society and Swedish Academy of Engineering, and a fellow of IEEE, ACM, and the NAE, and a whole slew of other such wonderful things. Among awards, U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, U.S. National Medal of Technology, but really quite special, the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. And it was the very first time that that was awarded. That was kind of setting up a prize that was equivalent, but more dollars, as I recall correctly, than the Nobel Prize. So again, that was exceedingly special. Personal interests include fine wine, gourmet cooking, and science fiction. Served with his wife Sigrid, were married in 1966, and have 2 sons. In any case, let's welcome VintCerf.
Well, thank you all very much. You want to get rid of that because it's a double echo. Now, several things. First of all, I have to get my PowerPoint slides in place, so you'll have to forgive me for just a moment while I adjust the parameters here. There we go. And bing. All right. So first of all, when you test that this is working okay, you can hear me in the back. The usual question is, can you hear me in the rear? And the answer is no, we ain't built that way. But okay, bad joke. -2. I want to I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you a sense for what I was trying to do with Ann in coming out here. So there's a premise that drove my interest in visiting in San Diego. One of them is that I believe there is a lot of innovation and business development going on in this area, but it's not very well known. Somehow or other, the spotlight has not moved here, except in a few cases. For example, Qualcomm is clearly one of the most significant of the companies in this area. But I also thought that maybe the people who are here didn't actually know very much about each other because they're all very focused on their own work, especially if they're trying to start new companies. So I thought, well, maybe if we could get them all together and get them to tell me what it is they were doing, that I could try to highlight this in this forum and then subsequently make it more visible to companies that are interested in partnerships, cooperation, or even support, financial support. So that was the premise. This is just a list of people. I'll leave it up for a moment. So these are people who participated in the roundtable sessions over the last couple of days. And for some of them are actually here tonight. And if I misspelled a name or if I missed one, I apologize. Here's the rest of the list. It was about 60 people. And they were coming in and out depending on what the topics of the roundtables were. And there were organizations represented as well. This is a list of the organizations whose people, sometimes more than one, were participating in the roundtable. So those of you who know the area and know these companies can see that this is a pretty good cross-section, very diverse cross-section of what's going on here. By no means covering everything, but certainly a wide variety. Here's some more of the organizations that participated in the last couple of days. So there's a warning for you ahead of time, and that is that the material that I've gathered here is not complete. We've spent many, many hours with lots of debate going back and forth, and I tried to take notes and tried to summarize. But for those of the people who are here who participated, just be prepared for the fact that I didn't get everything into this. And I will say, however, that one thing that I heard often was, I've known X for, or I've known about X, or I've known X for Y number of years, but didn't have any time to chat. And so I watched a lot of interactions among people who knew each other but never had time. And isn't it interesting? Sometimes you live in the same town, you never find time to talk. It's like the monuments and things like that. You never go unless you have visitors that come as guests, and then you feel like you have to do that. So I think maybe doing things like this would be a useful exercise from time to time, just to get people to talk to each other casually. The organizing themes, which Ann put together very, very cleverly, were these various topics lumped together into about 9 different sessions. And so you can see how diverse some of the discussions must have been. And second, this is my going and filtering. So this is you looking through my brain at what I knew about San Diego. So I knew about the universities, UCSD and SDSU, for example, and I didn't know it was called the Mesa. That was, Larry Smarr explained that to me, but the Scripps and the Salk Institute, I knew were here. I didn't know about the Sanford Burnham and the Sanford Consortium. That was news to me. So something I learned. And of course I knew about Link a bit because I'd known Irwin for a good long time now. I think we probably crossed paths about the time that the satellite link was going in the internal ARPANET, and then later the packet satellite system. So Linkabit played a significant role in helping to get that piece of the nascent internet up and running. And Viasat I also knew about, but I didn't know about Hypertech, and I didn't know about HNC. And I have a couple of slides on that. Craig Venter and I have interacted from time to time, and so I'm more or less aware of what he was doing. Connect was new to me, that's why it's in brackets. And the fact that I didn't know there were 20 colleges here. That was a surprise. And of course, when Larry told me there were 850 biotech companies in San Diego, it blew me away. I had just no clue that order of magnitude is what's happening here. But also I heard a meme that the San Diego firms think they have to go to Silicon Valley to get money and engineers. And I remember thinking, why is that? I mean, you've got good schools turning out good quality people. You've got companies you can raid engineers from. You have a number of venture capital firms But apparently it's still the case that there's a lot more venture money up in the Silicon Valley than there is here. So we need to correct that. So that's one of my objectives. I got these slides from Martha Dennis. They're not readable, but they give you the sense for the explosion of companies that have sort of splattered across the San Diego landscape from hybrid tech. It's a little bit like Hewlett-Packard starting, and then some of the other, what do we want to call it, chipset companies like Intel, Fairchild, and so on, have populated a lot of the Bay Area. Hybrid tech was one of the sources of a lot of diversity, and the other one is Linkabit itself, with lots and lots, as you can see from the tiny font, lots and lots of companies have spun out from the initial Big Bang that Linkabit started here. And I started looking into venture capital. I knew about the San Diego Venture Group because I'd interacted with them before. And I learned about the San Diego Economic Development Corporation while I was here. But I also discovered, just by poking around in the net, that there were a long list of other venture capital companies. But I suppose that even aggregating across all of those, that the amount of capital available might still be less here than there is in, for example, Silicon Valley or maybe Boston. So those were my going-in understandings of what was going on from the corporate and institutional point of view. The focus of all of these sessions, however, was very technical, and so I'm going to drag you through what I think I understood of the technical sessions. And again, I have to warn you, this is being filtered through my puny brain, and so I'm probably not going to get everything right. Some of the people who are in these meetings may levitate out of their seats, so don't be too surprised about that, especially if somebody says, but that's not what I said, or that's not what I meant. Now, I didn't attribute anything to anybody, so at least you don't have to worry about that. And so I didn't have one of these, and this dumbass guy said the following thing. So another thing I wanted to draw your attention to is how you decide whether or not you are successful in producing new companies and in transferring technology out of the research world into the useful one. And so one thing which is a sad fact, which I think is true here and elsewhere, is that about 95% of all the startups fail. Every venture capital company knows that, and they hope that they will have 5% success and maybe even a unicorn in order to cover the losses from companies that didn't make it. Some people in our discussions believe that even simple, better business practices would reduce that rate of failure to something smaller, maybe 65%. Those of you who lived through the dot boom period from about 1995 or so with the IPO of Netscape Communications and then the dot bust in April of 2000 will have noticed something interesting about that phenomenon. As soon as the Netscape Communications IPO hit and the stock went through the roof, everybody in the venture capital world, at least in the Silicon Valley area, was just throwing money at anything that looked like it had something to do with the internet and the World Wide Web. And the young people who were starting these companies were accumulating huge amounts of capital, and they were spending it, which is okay to first order, except for one thing. A lot of them didn't know the difference between capital and revenue. And so when they ran out of capital, they didn't know what happened. The first rule in economics is don't spend more money than you have or have available. And that didn't happen in all cases. So there was a big cratering sound in April of 2000 due to a lot of other things, but including that. And so these young folks who thought they were really smart because all that capital came in discovered they weren't so smart because there wasn't any revenue to back it up. But I think startups are not the only metric that we should count. And I want to urge you to keep that in mind. The real heart of successful business is innovation. And that comes out of research. And that can be transferred in a number of ways. It's not just by startups. Those transfers can take place into corporations like Qualcomm, which is a great big company, but it's fully capable of absorbing new ideas and generating new ones itself. And so if we're trying to measure how we are doing in the innovation space, please don't just count startups. Another thing you want to do is not just count the startups. It's also important to say, did any of them survive? And so I think a really good metric would be how many of the startups are still alive after 5 years. They might be still on their own, they might have been acquired, that's okay. But some of them may not survive even that long. And so we should measure ourselves on survivability in addition to starting up. And I learned, but didn't know, that there are also some self-organizing things going on in this area. Clean tech and biocom, for example, are multiple organization groups that are, I guess, sort of trying to help reinforce their interests in the same way. In Japan, you'd call this a kairetsu, but that's a kind of, that's a more bound together thing. These look like they're more loosely collected groups of companies with common interests. So now, all this is preamble. So now I'm going to try to walk you through some of the ideas that came up during the course of these roundtables. And I warn you ahead of time, there's technical stuff in here, and I'm actually not the expert on most of it. And so the consequence of this is going to be that I'm going to be interpreting what I think I understood, and you guys can pretend that you understand my interpretation, and then everything will be good. So let me start out by telling you that the first topic was genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics, or metabolomics. I had trouble learning how to pronounce that. That last one, I didn't know what that was. I thought it had something to do with metal or mumble. So it turns out it's the scientific study of the set of metabolites present within an organism, a cell, or tissue. Now, metabolites happen because living organisms consume food, and then they poop or pee, or they excrete whatever it was they didn't need. And the metabolites are the leftovers from all of that process. It turns out they are actually important, and you'll see in a minute why they're so important. So the first thing is that genomics is all about sequencing genes and trying to understand what are the rules for an organism's development. And the comment during the course of this meeting was that genetics was, and gene sequencing was so 20th century. And Illumina, which was participating in this event, was describing the process by which you actually assemble a gene sequence. And what happens is that the reading system doesn't actually just get this long continuous string. What it gets is these little teeny pieces, little short 16 segment pieces of the genetic sequence, and then they have to figure out what the right order is. So this reminds me of the Christmas things that you buy that say some assembly required. So that's true of the Illumina system. It has to assemble the bits and pieces into a sequence. The other thing that became apparent after the big push to get human genome sequenced and other genomes sequenced is that, at least in human beings, in our gut are a huge number of different kinds of bacteria, and their DNA dwarfs the DNA of a human being. And yet we have co-evolved. And so you can't ignore the fact that you have microbes in your digestive tract, because they have all kinds of effects, including helping you digest food, but they also get involved in your immune system. So understanding the microbiome and what's present in there turns out to be important. And then there's the other thing, genes don't just sit there, they get interpreted. And when they get interpreted, they produce proteins. And almost everything that goes on in your body is the interaction of and the assembly of proteins. So we have to understand all that. And then stuff happens, the organism consumes food and does all these other things, and it generates side effects, and that's all the metabolic outcome is little bits and pieces of molecules that are produced by those processes. And so that's worth paying attention to, because it tells you a little bit about how the body is actually functioning. It's sort of like examining the exhaust of your car to find out whether the engine is working well or spewing out nitrous oxide or carbon dioxide or other things. What's also interesting is that even though your genes don't change, unless there's some kind of mutation, you've been irradiated or something like that, the microbiome will change, and so will the metabolic output from day to day. And so it turns out to be important to track that stuff if you're trying to understand how is this body working. So you can see what I'm leading up to here is that the output of metabolic processes turns out to be a really important indicator of how well what is your health. And so just knowing the genetics is not nearly enough in order to deal with people's health. So as we move into the notion of personalized medicine, you'll see how important this turns out to be. Now, this was a big surprise for me. I understand diseases, and I think of diseases as germs showing up and doing some bad thing to you. But the real fact I learned, at least this is how I interpreted it, is that the metabolic outputs have a real impact on how well your body is working. And almost all disease is a result of some kind of inflammation. And so once some organ of your body has been disturbed and it's grumpy and unhappy, that inflammation is what causes the disease, including things like cancer. So there's another question: is how do I find out how well the body is doing? I mean, it's like the car whose exhaust you plug in an analyzer on the tailpipe. You can do that with people too, right? Because it's easy to get samples of urine and sputum and stool. It's a little harder to get blood. I mean, that's the part I don't like. And biopsies are even worse. So these are kind of in the order of difficulty of getting samples of how the body is doing. The thing that completely blew me away is that it's possible to use mass spectrometry to identify which molecules are present in the metabolites, and using a very, very small amount of blood. So if you're interested in analyzing the body's output from metabolic processes, just a finger prick is good enough to do this mass spectrographic analysis. It's more complicated than that. In fact, theorem 206 at the bottom says everything is more complicated, and that's true of this too. So this fact that we can use mass spectrometry to understand in a very deep way how your body is functioning was really quite surprising, and it requires a very small amount of information, about 10 microliters of blood. The other thing that turned out to be interesting and important is that when you're sequencing the bacteria in the gut, you have to sequence all and identify all the way down to the strain level. This is the most detailed level of identification of a microbe. And the reason for that is that things like E. coli are everywhere, but certain strains are not your friends. And you have to know which ones are present in order to decide whether there's a problem. So now we're back to how much ability we have to observe and at what level of detail in order to understand how someone is doing. So now we get to personalized medicine. One interesting thing was to get the microbiome, what are the genetic sequences of the bacteria in the gut from 2,000 different people, in order to do machine learning with that data, in order to then take other sequences from other people and to figure out what kinds of patterns are we seeing in other parties' microbiomes. So this notion of feeding known information into a pattern matching system, a machine learning system, is another diagnostic tool. But it requires that we gather a lot of data in order to do the training. And when we get to the big data discussion, you'll see how that's relevant. Another thing that I mentioned before is that diurnal or even hourly views of the metabolic output can turn out to be important, again, to understand how well health is proceeding. Now, Larry Smarr, bless his heart, he's right here in the second row. You wave your hand, Larry. Is probably the most quantized person in the universe today. I'm sure I didn't get this exactly right, but I was just jotting down. We asked him, why the hell did you do that? And he said, well, once upon a time, I was curious about the omega-3, omega-6 ratio. It's some kind of fat, right? LDL or LPL or some kind of fat. And he wanted to know what the ratio was, and the doctor said, why do you care? It's not important. He said he wanted to know anyway, and he had a little tantrum. And went off and then did the blood analysis to find out, and he discovered a particular metabolite was 900 times more present than it should be on the average. Well, this is a signal, and of course for Larry that was like a red flag, saying you should go find out more. So he got himself fully sequenced, maybe more than once, and eventually discovered himself basically that he had irritable bowel disease, and maybe even a predisposition to Crohn's syndrome because of his genetic predispositions. And I always knew that Larry was sort of irritable, but I didn't know that it was, that now there's a medical reason for it. And again, Larry, I wrote down that there were 250 indicators that you were gathering data on. Is that the right order of magnitude? He says yes. which is astonishing. I mean, you can imagine measuring 250 things about your body on a regular basis. So he's accumulating an enormous pile of data, but it turns out to be very important to see that in time series and then do correlations to find out why do these various indicators go up and down together, what could cause that. And that eventually led to the diagnosis and eventually, I guess, some surgery as well. And since I'm picking on Larry, I have to tell you that he's the sort of guy that you don't want to have say, let me tell you about my operation. Because, you know, if you're not looking, you'll take him into a 3D cave thing so you can see the inside of his body in 3 dimensions. And I don't remember what you have this thing on your desk. It's the little 3D printing of your duodenum or something. And it's an ugly little critter. So, but, you know, true to Larry's interest in promoting science and willing to be a guinea pig himself, he decided when surgery was required that he would promote a whole new way of doing the surgery. So getting 3D MRIs so that we could build a 3D view of his body, particularly his abdomen, and then matching that up with the intuitive surgical Da Vinci robot, then letting the surgeon see both the 3D structure and through the eyes of the robot allowed the surgeon to plan and then execute this surgery. And this has never been done before. So, of course, all kinds of complications came along about permissions and, you know, getting things hooked up and everything else. But now that procedure, I think, could easily become the normal way in which one would do these sorts of surgeries, because now you have a very, very clear sense of where the operating area is, and you can pre-plan everything because you've got this 3D model of what's going on. Now, it turns out we had another guinea pig, and that was Tyler Orion, who discovered one day, she was a dancer, okay, so this is a person agile on her feet. Is Tyler here? There she is. Wave your hand, Tyler. Okay, so you don't mind if I show everybody your medical record here. So, I want you to understand that in these sessions dove pretty deep into this in order to understand personalized medicine from a personal point of view. So Tyler reported that one day she couldn't stand on the balls of her feet. She just froze, couldn't move. And so then, upon further investigation, discovered that she had a predisposition for cardio and tibial myopathy. And in case you don't know what myopathy is, it's where your muscles don't work right because the signaling isn't getting the muscles to do what they're supposed to do. You know, you think you want to go this way and your foot goes that way or something. There's also a problem with, she had a problem with spinal stenosis. This is where your spine bends the wrong way. And the nerves go through holes in your spine in order to reach your extremities. And if the nerves don't go through the holes very clearly, then either the nerve signals are interfered with or you hurt, you know, like sciatica, because the nerve gets pinched. So she had this collection of syndromes that were clearly affecting her ability to function normally. Now, I had never heard of this thing before. It was called Titin, TTN, pronounced Titin. That's the largest gene in our genetic arsenal. And apparently it was failing to deliver a particular protein to a particular part of the cell that influenced the way in which muscles responded to signaling. Now, I think it's not fully resolved yet. Yeah, she's saying yes. However, but she spent several days at National Institutes of Health. And my first thought was when she showed up and the doctor said, boy, that's interesting. That's not what you ever want to hear from a doctor. Or the other one was, I've never seen that before. You don't want to hear that either. He says, oh, I know exactly what to do about that. So we had our two guinea pigs telling us about their experiences. And what that emphasized for me is the feasibility of really serious personalized medicine. So you hear this as a buzzword, but today, or in the last couple of days, I've seen a real feasibility for that. What's interesting about all this to me is that none of this would happen without an improved ability to actually measure and observe things about our body all the way down to the cellular level and even inside the cell. And this is like physics. If you can measure it, then you can do something to model it to analyze it, make predictions. And so our improved abilities to do this sort of measuring and observing is important. But in order for this to become the norm, there's going to have to be a lot of training, retraining in the medical profession, and the FDA and others will have to approve the procedures that go along with that. This leads to another implication, and that is the shifting standard of care. And this is one of the most lethargic measures in the medical industry. I'm sorry, Alex, my chief of staff's son is a doctor, and so I'm reminding him that he needs to be ready to shift his view of what standard of care is. I don't want the 20th century standard of care. I want the 21st century standard of care. But getting there is not so easy. Think of the insurance companies that say, well, did you do the standard of care, as of 1997? You say, no, I was trying to do something 20 years ahead. And the answer is, well, that's not our standard of care. I don't want the insurance companies to dictate medicine. I want the doctors to decide what to do based on what they know. But that's going to be a sluggish process in order to reach to shift the way in which we decide standard of care's function. The other thing I really worry about is in the U.S. medical system, if there's no code for that, you don't get the treatment. This is a terrible situation and something, again, that's going to have to change if we're going to achieve the personalized medicine that we hope for. Craig Venter is very interested in helping humans live longer, and the older I get, the more interested I am in that. We have a company in Google is part of what's called the Alphabet Company, and one of our companies is called the Calico Company, the California Life Corporation, and they've noticed that people get old, and they're trying to figure out how to stop that. And of course, the engineers, think, well, that's easy, and said, no, that's not the way we wanted to stop people from getting old. So the idea is how to live a long, healthy life. And I would trade, 100 years in a day and then, total collapse if it would be healthy for that 100 years. So in this case, the Human Longevity Organization has got the full genome sequences plus the single nucleotide polymorphisms, of which there are like 8,000 per person. They have high resolution MRIs, a huge amount of data. The idea here is to get a good baseline for all of the people who were part of the study, and then look for variations in order to detect, for example, early indications of a disease. It is reported now that of the patients that they have run through this system, that 3 or 4% of them have asymptomatic cancer. They have cancer, but they don't know it, and there are no symptoms. Discovering cancer early is a really good idea. And so that's another benefit of doing this sort of process. Here's the thing that completely blew me away. It was also reported that when you sleep, that's like theoretically it's about a third of our lives are spent asleep, that if you track variations in electroencephalograms, even just a single sensor, not the whole 48 thing, that tracking that in fairly accurately and high resolution actually can be used as a diagnostic tool to detect bodily conditions. This is a big surprise. But if you think a little bit about it, how many times have they said, get 8 hours of sleep? When you're asleep, your body is doing stuff. Your brain is apparently just going through trying to sort out all the stuff that you did during the day and make sense out of it and do long-term memory storage. But it may also be doing a bunch of repair work. And it's entirely possible or conceivable that while you are sleeping, that there are indications of what your body is trying to do. That's a big surprise for me. We didn't get down into the details of how the hell could that possibly work. On the other hand, it's a very non-invasive thing. And so anything that's non-invasive that lets you do better diagnosis, I thought was really attractive. So now you can see all of this in the background is consuming huge amounts of data. And so what do we do with all this? How do we analyze it? How do we store it? The San Diego Supercomputer Center, which I hope all of you know about, has been around for quite a while, about 30 years. And they have not only strengths in computation, because they keep changing their supercomputers with new technology, but their staff is also familiar with dealing with data. And so they have really good customer relations with the scientists who are trying to use the data and the computer capabilities to analyze, model, and predict various and sundry processes, whether it's physical phenomena or medical phenomena or something else. So that's important to know that that asset is here in San Diego, and it's accessible not just to the academics, but it's accessible to the private sector as well. What seemed to be missing in this area, despite all of the efforts, which we will come back to a little while later, is a consistent high-speed communications infrastructure that any of the companies in the area could get access to, which would take them to, for example, the San Diego Supercomputer Center if they needed its resources, or to some of the other cloud computing resources that are available in the rest of the country. And so thinking your way through creating a really high power, high performance communication environment for the institutions in the San Diego area is worth your time to work through, figure out where it isn't available and find a way to make that happen, because it opens up opportunities for computation. I think there's also a very big opportunity for machine learning processes. If you know a little bit, like I do, just a little bit about machine learning, what you know is that most of these systems require a huge amount of repetition in order to learn something. So it's not a fast process, it's a fairly slow process. You have to keep repeatedly running the system through some kind of a task. For example, compare a cat and a dog. And after a large number of iterations, these machine learning systems figure out how to tell the difference between a cat and a dog. Now, fortunately, they can also tell the difference between other things, like, for example, a picture of your retina. They can tell whether you have diabetic retinopathy or not. And in that particular case, Google actually tested this. We had 85 optometrists who, or ophthalmologists who looked at the images and said, yes, this person has the syndrome and this person doesn't. And then we trained our machine learning systems to distinguish between the two. Once they were trained, they did a better job than the ophthalmologists did in actually detecting this syndrome. So the whole idea here is to take advantage of machine learning in order to amplify our ability to look at large numbers of these kinds of samples and make diagnoses. So here was an interesting thought that came up. Universities, like UCSD, for example, have very special capabilities because they often are there because they've got research grants to acquire the equipment in order to carry out a particular research program. But sometimes the equipment is not 100% occupied. So could it be made available to the general public? And one of the things that Larry does is running Cal IT2 is to provide that access to parties outside of the university setting. And so if you think about this, it could be a kind of business where people pay for access to that special equipment when it isn't needed by other researchers. That revenue could offset the research costs. That does a good thing because it actually allows you to pay for the equipment without having to get grants to cover all the costs. But it's also a great tool for tech transfer, because now those institutions that use those tools now know why they're important, why they're valuable, and they can afford to use it because they didn't have to pay for all the capital themselves. And so I would rank that as one of the important ways of demonstrating universities' ability to transfer knowledge into the private sector. So that's a sort of notion that came up, and perhaps a business could be constructed that way. Then we got off into autonomous software. And this is, I had a rant on this subject, so I will expose you to a part of the rant. I'm actually quite worried about software that decides to do stuff without you in the middle or any human being in the loop. And if you think about the Internet of Things, that's exactly what we're doing. We're putting software into devices and letting the software decide what to do. And to first order, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Your thermostat tries to keep temperature at what you want it to be. But a self-driving car is a little bit more elaborate, and it's running on its own. And what if it doesn't do what you expect it to do? What if there's a bug that the people who wrote the software didn't detect, and the car does something unexpected? So I just worry about being too relaxed about software. And the reason for this is I used to make a living writing programs. And in the last 80 years, not mine, but others, we haven't figured out how to write software that doesn't have bugs. And we don't have very good tools for figuring that out either. And so we know there are bugs, and they can be quite hazardous if they encounter conditions that the programmer didn't anticipate, like a car going off the cliff. So we have to make sure we can fix the bugs. And that's a challenge, because if you have to load new software into a device, then the device needs to know that this is coming from the right source. And what if it isn't? What if it's from somebody who wants to put malware into your devices? Now you're in trouble. So this is a non-trivial thing. We have to fix the bugs. We have to make sure that the bug fixes come from the right places. There are a whole lot of other issues about autonomous software that I won't take time with, because this will go on forever otherwise. I just want to draw your attention to the ethical responsibility that people who make these devices should feel. Whether they do or not is a different question. But there are people who say, well, I just want to grab a piece of software and stick it in this device and sell it, and I'm done. Well, some people did that with webcams. And they just grabbed some operating system software. It was open source. They just threw it in. Those webcams got used in a botnet to deliver a denial of service attack to a company called Dyn several months ago. 500,000 webcams were taken over by a botnet herder and aimed, their megabit per second streams aimed at the target website in the internet. If you multiply 1 million bits per second times 500,000 webcams, that's 550 gigabits a second. That's a hell of a load, and it knocked the company over. So, and the reason that it was so easy for the botnet herder to do that is there was no access control in the webcams at all. It simply lets you do that. And so the person who made those webcams, in some sense, or the company, should bear some responsibility. But you know, the current situation is we don't have a legal regime that determines whether or not there is liability there, and that's something that will eventually evolve, I'm pretty sure. So there was one thought. Somebody said, "What about those big chips that control your car? You know, you open up the hood. It used to be that you could figure out mechanically why the car wasn't working. Now you can't tell because it's just this big damn chip, and you know you can't fiddle with it." So the question is, what would happen if there was something wrong with those chips? What would you do to fix it? Well, one person suggested, well, we just mail them, you know, another chip, and they could have somebody plug it in. And then one of the more nefarious members of the round table said, well, in that case, I would just send these people chips that had bad software in them that I could control, and they, you know, wouldn't know any better, and they'd plug it into the car. This gets into one of those real issues about the sophistication or lack of sophistication and the level of trust that people have. We have to actually create a certain degree of paranoia in the population about this kind of software in order to prevent them from being mistakenly putting things where they don't belong. There's also this business of large numbers of devices with a lot of software interacting on the net. No one can possibly test all of the possible interactions on the internet. And so every time a device talks to another device, it's almost like an experiment, because never have those two devices with their loads of software ever interacted with each other before. There are emergent properties that come out of this sort of interaction, and we can't predict what they all are. And so this is yet another sort of hazard that we all have to worry about, and we talked more about that when we got to cybersecurity. We talked a lot about deep learning, and I've alluded to some of that with machine learning in general. One of the things that's really important is if you're going to teach a machine to do something, whether it's a discrimination task or a functional task like driving, you have to have really good quality data, and it has to cover as many of the situations as you can possibly think of. Otherwise, the system will not behave the way you expect it to. One possibility is you have a whole bunch of different neural networks that have learned specialty things to do, and then you pick which one to apply when you have a problem to solve. So you have a whole band of these things. You don't have to have one device that's you know, brilliant on all courses. You can have different ones that have specialized to particular things. I'm going to skip through a little bit of this. Here was a rather surprising example of machine learning. The challenge was to take pictures of real bedrooms and then have the machine learning system draw a photorealistic picture of a bedroom that doesn't exist. And the challenge was to figure out whether it was a real bedroom scene or whether it was one that had been generated by this algorithm. And the two instances of the program were trying to fool each other, basically. And in the course of if the machine succeeded in fooling the other, you got plus points for that. And so this cycle of attempt to fool each instance eventually led to photorealistic scenes that were generated that could not be distinguished from the real thing. And so that's how a number of these machine learning systems work. Some of you may remember that Google last year played Go in Seoul and challenged Lee Sedol to a 5-game match. This was called AlphaGo. That was our software. And it won 4 out of 5 games. And the way that it was trained to do this is that we had the machine learning tools playing each other, millions of games back and forth, learning what worked and what didn't work and what moves would be successful. So the other thing that's kind of interesting is that these neural networks, because they have to iterate many, many times in order to learn something, is a little bit like what happens to us. We learn things, but we don't know that we're actually how we're learning. So when you get on a bicycle and you finally don't fall over anymore, you don't quite understand how you learned that. It's like muscle memory or playing tennis and things like that. So some of the machine learning stuff that goes on is just like that. They have to iterate for a long time, and then they get really good at it, but nobody exactly knows why or how. David Brin, where's David? Is David here? Maybe not. No, he said he couldn't come tonight. So good, I get to talk about him. So David, in one of the sessions, said that he was worried that one possible crisis could arise where we set the machines just watching human beings, watching the inputs and the human beings' outputs in response, and eventually, treated human beings as if we were black boxes, and eventually figured out how to do whatever it was we were doing better than we do. And, this is not a completely crazy thing to worry about, because that's exactly how we are training these things in specialty things like playing Go or playing chess. And so these things do learn how to do things better than humans do, but only in fairly narrow kinds of tasks. I've already alluded to a lot of cybersecurity issues, so I won't chew up too much more time on that. But an observation got made that the more we put value in digital artifacts, the more attraction there is for the criminals to attack and get that valuable information, and the more we are incented to try to secure it. So that's the phenomenon that's going on right now. We're investing more and more in digital artifacts that have increasing value, and people are going after them because of that value. Here's an example of something I didn't realize. Somebody who had built a worm, that's sort of like a virus that propagates around the net, was just trying it out to see if he could get it to propagate. He wasn't trying to do anything malicious or anything else, but somebody who knew about spam, which is just mail that you didn't want, but he was trying to get you to click on something or buy something, paid the guy that built the worm in order to send these bots around. And so it became a business. So the guys who were building the botnets were actually earning a living helping the spam guys send spam to you, which you should not be happy about. The other problem we have is that the tools for doing these various things have gotten into the hands not only of, we call them script kiddies, where they get an attack tool. They don't understand how it works, but they just pulled it off the net and they can run it. Well, the thieves and the script kiddies and the nation states are all having access now to these tools. And so you can't really tell. Some of these attacks look like they could have come from a nation state level adversary, and yet it could be some script kiddie who's running it. So this is really a serious problem that we have to try to deal with. I'm going to skip over a couple of these things because I know we're running out of time. One thing which I found very interesting is that here in the San Diego area, there are a number of startups that are actually simply watching the internet, trying to figure out what's going on, in particular to detect whether or not there are attacks taking place. And that ultimately may turn out to be a very beneficial kind of practice that people can monetize and also use to protect you and me. Many of us think if it hasn't happened to me, it won't happen to me. So we hear this all the time, won't happen to me, or I'm glad it didn't happen to me. A lot of people just don't appreciate the risk that we're in. And so we need to retrain people to think more carefully about that. I think we need better programming environments to avoid making bugs, because that's the source of all the bad attacks. It's the bugs that's in the software that people exploit. If we didn't have any bugs, they wouldn't have anything to exploit. And library, this isn't about books. This is about libraries of software. People build these libraries, and you sort of grab the software off the shelf and throw it into whatever it is that you're building. But if you're not really aware of what's going on in the library, where did it come from, what is its functionality, you could actually put stuff together that doesn't work the way it's supposed to, for precisely because it's not well enough documented. Okay, I'm going to skip through these. That's a lot of, we spent a lot of time on cybersecurity, you can tell. There are lots of issues here about liability and rules of the game. The one thing I want to draw your attention to, two things at the bottom here. One of them is that most of the security work up until now has been software based. A lot of us think that we should build hardware that reinforces the software in its attempt to secure systems. And finally, some people say, well, why don't we just buy insurance? Doesn't that solve all the problem? Of course, the answer is no. The insurance may deal with the financial liability you end up with because of a bug that you propagated in some product that you built. But all it does is pay potentially for the financial damage. It doesn't get rid of the bug, and that's a serious problem. We talked a bit about data communications in this area, and one thing I can tell you is that you have an extraordinary asset in Cal IT2, Larry's company, or Larry's institution, but also CNIC, which is a regional communication system. You have a lot of connectivity and high capacity linking some of the institutions into the rest of the public internet. There's even something that almost nobody here knew about, and that's the High Performance Wireless Research and Education Network, which is propagating across the San Diego area. It's reaching across to Orange County. It's reaching to Riverside County. We just hooked up, just 2 days ago, the High Performance Wireless Network to the CNIC fiber network in order to let those two things work together. The HPREN system is linking meteorological stations. It's being used to monitor for forest fires. It's got cameras with triggers on it, so we can, when we see an event happen or we sense an event happen, we can start taking pictures. The propagation of forest fires is far better understood now thanks to the HPREN system and its sensors than ever before, because they can detect a lightning strike, they can see a fire start, they can track the fire all the way from beginning to end. In the past, that was impossible. Nobody ever watched fires start. They couldn't see how they propagated. And now we have models that will tell us how some of those fires could propagate. And of course, they're all linked to the global internet. Viasat is a company here that has a really interesting idea. They want to put 3 synchronous satellites up at 22,400 miles orbits with spot beams that will deliver 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up anywhere on the surface of the Earth, in addition to being able to do spot beams at very much higher speeds. So that system could make for a huge amount of connectivity that doesn't exist today. And finally, of course, there's fixed and mobile communications, and Marty Cooper, who's right here in the front row or second row, had a lot to do with starting the whole mobile telephone business way back in 1973. My favorite story about Marty is that I called him up in 1983 when he turned the system up. He turned on the mobile phones, and Bob Kahn and I turned on the internet. And I was invited to go look at Marty's Motorola phone. And my first reaction is, somebody said, it's a phone. I said, where are the wires? And there aren't any wires. I asked more questions, and the person who invited me didn't have an answer. He said, why don't you call Marty and ask, how he did it? So I called Marty up, and I asked him, how long did the battery last? And he said, 20 minutes, but it's a 3.5-pound phone, and you can't hold it up longer than that. So, it was a perfect match. Things have gotten a lot better since then. I also learned something else I didn't know. You got a 14,000 node street network, sticking on top of the street lamps of this 802.11 wireless network that can be used for a variety of different purposes. You can think of smart cities and the communication that would be part of that. Gosh, already, we're way over time, aren't we? What do we do? I hate to not say anything at all about quantum computing, but I will tell you the focus of the attention in this particular workshop was on work that's going on by Google up in Santa Monica and or Venice anyway, and Santa Barbara. the simple thing here that I want you to go away with about quantum computing is that under certain conditions, a quantum-based computing system can reach an answer exponentially faster than conventional computing. However, it doesn't work for all possible problems. And so there are very important problems that can't be solved using conventional computing that can be solved with quantum computing. And that's the primary focus of attention here, is to identify algorithms that will let us solve these problems much more quickly and therefore be able to answer questions that we could not even begin to answer before. And I have to apologize to my Google friends for not giving more time on the quantum computing. I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I'm way over time. I did want people to have a little sense of why this speed up happens. So think about gravity. You know, you all know about, we go around the sun, gravity keeps us from flying off somewhere. When you have two things like Earth and the sun, and you ask about the orbital dynamics, that's a solvable problem. You can write a closed form solution to that. As soon as you add a third thing, like the moon, this no longer is a trivial problem to solve. You actually can't get a closed form solution. What you end up having to do is to say it's time zero, everybody is right here. Now it's a tiny bit time later, and you calculate where everybody will have moved based on the gravitational attraction. And then you keep doing these teeny little steps, and it takes forever to calculate what the orbits are going to be, because you have to take these tiny steps to make it accurate. It's possible, this is just an analogy, but it's possible with a quantum computing system to get an answer much faster without having to go through all those tiny little steps. And that's why this is so exciting. We're planning to make those quantum capabilities available in the cloud so that other people can get access to and discover algorithms that can be sped up using that technology. We had an absolutely amazing debate about blockchain, and it mostly was about Bitcoin and big fights over whether Bitcoin was a good idea or a bad idea. And in the end, I concluded that I couldn't decide. I am still, frankly, a little skeptical about cryptocurrency, electronic currency, and everything else. But there are a bunch of applications associated with the technology called blockchain that could turn out to be quite useful. And so my conclusion in the end is that we should still keep working on it. And there are a number of places here in the San Diego area that are doing just that. Lots of possible applications associated with this. Think of it, when you hear blockchain, just think of people making ledgers, keeping track of transactions, except lots of copies, so that nobody can say, this is the real transaction, and everybody else will say, no, it isn't, because I have a copy too. And I can validate that that's what the transaction was. So the blockchain is a way of keeping people from cheating, because everybody else can see what the transactions are. There's a transparency element there, something which keeps people honest, forces people to be honest, because they can't cheat very easily. We spent some time on digital preservation. The short form on this one is that if all of you who are taking pictures with your mobile phones, and there's one of them, and think that bits will last forever because somehow they're just these ethereal things, you'd be wrong about that. The bits don't last necessarily because the medium in which they have been put may not last. You know, the polycarbonate CD-ROMs, you know, after 14, 15, 20 years may no longer actually have bits in them. Or worse, the thing you've all experienced, there's no reader that can read that medium anymore. So I have little 3.5-inch floppies and 5.25-inch floppies and CD-ROMs and nothing to read them with. And even if I had something to read them with, if I need software to interpret what the bits mean, like it's a spreadsheet, I may not be able to run the program that knows what the bits mean because this program doesn't run on the machines of the time that I am looking at that old file. And so we have a real problem right now, and I predict the digital dark age if we don't figure out how to preserve the semantics of the bits that we are creating every single day. And even your photographs may be at risk because there are formats associated with those images. And if the software that knows what the formats are doesn't run anymore 50 years from now or 100 years from now, then your descendants may not ever be able to see what you looked like in the 21st century. So this is actually a real problem. And finally, we had a really weird conversation, and if I've insulted anybody, it was on purpose, This was not what I expected. We had an honest-to-God epistemological discussion about very fundamental notions of robotics. This was a really fascinating discussion from the philosophical point of view, looking at the thermodynamics and the dynamics of robots as reducing energy levels, trying to slide down the energy chain. That's sounding almost incoherent. So let me just say that we were struggling. I was struggling anyway to think my way through self-organizing systems and how we might get robots to evolve themselves. That was the whole idea here, was to figure out a way to allow a robot to evolve itself. And we're the only robots right now that do that easily using biological processes. And the question is, could we possibly do that with a robot? Almost done, believe it or not. So there were other topics that we didn't discuss. And so I draw those to your attention only to say that there's a whole lot more going on in the San Diego area than we could cover in those 9 things. But there are some steps forward that I'd like to propose. Having discovered the intensity and depth of what's going on in this part of the world, I want to propose that the people who were participant and anyone here who's interested could summarize what you're doing, what your companies are trying to do, what your research projects are, send those to Ann Kerr. We'll summarize those, put them up on a website. We will draw attention to them, to the venture companies and to maybe others who are looking for partners in order to stir the pot, in order to get more awareness of what's going on in the Silicon Valley. There is a venture firm that has just started up. It was announced just a few days ago for Southern California venture capital. The chairman of Alphabet, Eric Schmidt, and the former head of Google Ventures, Bill Maris, announced this fund. And I sent a note to Eric saying, is San Diego considered part of Southern California? And he said yes. So the good news is that we will feed this information to them as well. So I'll stop there. I want to thank you for allowing me to take more time than I intended. I'm happy to try to answer questions if you have any, but I understand if everybody just wants to run out of the room screaming. But thank you very much for allowing me to take the time.
Roger Bingham, are you in the audience? Okay, I'd like to note Roger is going to help lead the Q&A for just a short period.
Okay, all right.
And I'd like to make one correction. I hate to correct you,
Yeah,
but
no, it's fine.
instead of my personal email, would you mind emailing to info@surfsup.sd.com?
Okay, I didn't know that part. Okay. So before you do anything, I'm hearing impaired, so I've got these little things. So hang on one. Let's see if this works. Go ahead.
So this is I'm just sort of going to do the concierge thing here and see if I can get some questions from people. One thing that surprised me hugely when you began it reminded me of an old story of Sidney Brenner used to tell. And obviously Sidney was a huge founder of a lot of this sort of stuff in terms of with the worm and so on. But he was at a conference once, and afterwards there was all the journalists came around and said to him, Professor Brenner, what do you think is the most important omics science? And Sidney said, econ.
Economics, yes. That makes a very good point.
Your thing there about the 95%
yes.
rate, which I'd never seen before, was staggering. I mean, do you mind if I ask him to just go back on that one and say what to do?
About that?
Yes.
So, well, look, most of the failures have reasons, okay? And you could list a few of them. One, we ran out of money. Another one is I didn't manage the company very well. A third one is I misjudged the market. Fourth one is I priced myself out of the market. There are a whole series of things that companies should adopt as disciplines before they launch into the system. You have to understand what you're doing. And I think a number of these folks are so focused on building a product that they don't think about the market that they are trying to satisfy. Yeah. Also, the market can shift out from under you. If you don't recognize that in time, then your company might fail. So, if I have a choice of a CEO that's had a failure before And a CEO that hasn't, I'm going to pick the one that had a failure before, generally speaking, because they'll recognize the symptoms sooner than the others.
Yeah.
But that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Larry, do you have any comments on some of
Other people I've had.
All right, so yes, there's one at the back there.
There we go.
If you were a 21-year-old college graduate, what would you study for your PhD?
You know, I would go straight into microbiomics and, you know, studying of biological systems. In fact, in spite of the fact that I'm not 21, I got a copy of a book called The Microbiology of the Cell, Bruce Alberts and a bunch of other guys, 1,766 pages. It's a dead tree. And I've been reading through this thing. When you look inside of a cell, which I used to think was a bag of water with stuff floating around inside, it's like Manhattan. I mean, this is the most complex, you know, incredibly packed thing. Stuff doesn't move easily around in the cell. There are things called microtubules, and, you know, they grow on one end, and there's Pac-Man, you know, eating them on the other end. And there are these little proteins that walk along the microtubules to deliver other proteins to the right place in the cell, except sometimes they misdeliver, and that causes problems, inflammations, and other things like the thing that Tyler was talking about. But this is absolutely unbelievably complex. So that's where I would go because I'm so fascinated by it. And if I didn't go there, I'd go after bioelectronics because I'm beginning to see amazing linkages between our bodies and neural systems and electronics. My wife has 2 cochlear implants. She's a perfect example of what happens when you match up the electronics with the biological system. So that's what I would do. Other questions?
There's one behind you.
Yep, go ahead.
Pretty good. I was Chris Pickford, a general physician in San Diego for years, and my father was involved in transmitting brainwaves back in the Intel satellite days. But I had an opportunity to go to the Future Med conference with Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil.
Oh, yes.
Coming in over video. And I had a chance to ask him the question I'd like to pose to you.
Okay.
Which do you think is a greater risk to U.S. citizens? The U.S. government, the Chinese government, or artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow. There are, I would say, I mean, not picking on anybody in particular, it depends on which risk you're worried about. I don't think AI is as big a risk as some people make it out to be. I don't agree with Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking that the robots are taking over and it's a scary thing. I think of artificial intelligence as a tool that we will use. That's how it's being used now. When you do a Google search, when you do Google Translate, you're seeing artificial intelligence at work for you. In terms of the U.S. government and the Chinese government, given the present U.S. government, that's a really interesting trade-off. The Chinese are a huge challenge. Let me not say a threat. They are a huge challenge. They have a growing economy. It is a very robust economy, and they are very focused on this because it's a command economy. The U.S. government doesn't seem to have its act together. So right now, if there's a threat, it's that the Chinese are better organized than we are.
Do you think as somebody who knows...
I'm sorry, I can't hear a thing because the microphone's...
I'm just wondering, as somebody who knows the internet as well as you do you know whether the reports of North Korean involvement, Russian involvement, and all those others, my understanding from the people I know that are technical, is anybody out there can pretend to be virtually anybody else. So how does anybody know whether the Russians are doing it or whether the North Koreans are doing it?
There is a nugget of truth in what you say. False flag attacks are commonly attempted, but it turns out that it's really hard to completely hide everything. And so for the most part, the intelligence communities, the 17 of them that reported that the Russians are the ones that went after the DNC, for example, it's pretty good evidence of that. Same with the North Koreans and the Sony situation.
Hello. You mentioned the number of failure modes for startups and other things. One thing you didn't mention, which is something in my world a lot, which I was curious why you didn't mention it, which is low engagement of employees.
Ah.
Because you put it the Gallup stuff and all the 20 to 30% where people are just basically clocking it, and that untapped possibility there. where would you put that in, and why did you not mention that?
Because I didn't think of it, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because the Gallup polls show exactly that. I'm really embarrassed, actually. I've been a senior advisor to the Gallup company for 15 years now. I do know exactly what you're saying. Jim Clifton, who's the CEO of the company, has reported repeatedly that disengagement is very common. And the real problem there, I think, is that unless you create an environment where people feel empowered, then you're going to get this disengagement. At Google, for example, and I say this only because I'm there and so I have a more familiarity with it, you are really empowered to do stuff, including fail, including trying things out that might not work. And there are a lot of companies where that's not considered acceptable. So engagement, you're absolutely right, is one of the failure factors.
Yes.
The Southern California investment package that's been put together, we think, at least I think about San Diego being a place where serious technology is being developed. And I think about Los Angeles as being a place where...
It's Hollywood.
It's Hollywood, right. And I'm curious, is there an allocation of funds already being made? And what will you be what will Alphabet and the fund be investing in?
Okay. So first of all, it's not an Alphabet fund. This is something that Eric Schmidt personally is doing with Bill Maris and possibly other investors. They're just putting this fund together. So the answer is, I don't know any of the parameters yet. But because it's so early, this is why I wanted to get San Diego in front of those guys for exactly the same reason that you want to, which is to get the allocations to come down here. Okay.
So
one
that
more.
was exactly the segue into my question, which is,
right.
This is one of the best trip reports I've ever heard.
Oh.
And, I've gone to lots of conferences,
Wow.
I've written trip reports.
Wow.
So thank you for that. But the purpose of trip reports is to inform senior management and keep them sort of on the cutting edge. So what do you plan to do with Alphabet, with what you've learned here?
Well, actually, I'm looking forward to telling the folks at Alphabet in some form or other that we're missing the boat if we don't show up down here and make sure we discover what's going on. Is any of it relevant to what we want to do? And so the summary of our reporting, go find out. But I want other companies to do the same thing, not just Alphabet.
Hi. I have a question for you. You mentioned several things that we need to improve and whatnot. What do you think the causes are that we are so far behind Silicon Valley in our investment? Are we lazy? We have Salk, we have UCSD, we have all these resources. So what gives?
I think, well, that's what brought me here in the first place, was that I know you have Salk, and I know you have all these other things that I learned about. And so the answer is partly that people don't know about it. And I think even in Silicon Valley itself, there are people that don't know the scope of what's going on. And so you have to make yourselves more visible. And one way to do that, I guess, is to steer people in your direction. So the whole Surf's Up here was exactly to try to find out what's going on and who can I tell about it once I discovered what's happening here. You need more evangelists to come and spread the word about San Diego.
It's only been going since 1960, of course, UCSD and the Salk. So
yes,
pretty good.
Yes.
Anne?
Vin, I'd like to make an observation just for the audience that a number of people in these research roundtables across section are intending to continue these kind of discussions, smaller group though, and put together a little coalition to answer the mail and push on Google.
And push on Google. Hey, it's not just Google. One more. I think we should probably do, here we got this one. So let's do two more, this one and that one, and then I think we should probably wrap up. Yep.
Okay, as an internet evangelist, how do you add value to Google and Alphabet?
Well, let me put it this way. My title is Chief Internet Evangelist, right? And you would think by this time, who needs to evangelize the internet, But about 3.5 billion people are online. I have an office next to Eric Schmidt in Mountain View when I'm there. The last time we ran into each other, which is fairly infrequent because we're both on the road, he told me I wasn't allowed to retire because I'm only half done. We have 50% of the world is online and the other 50% isn't. And I should point out to you that it is not trivial to get more internet built, especially in places where the per capita GDP is lower. And of course, as the internet spreads, two things are going on. You're reaching to places where it's less affordable, and at the same time, we keep driving costs down for the equipment and the communication. And so you can watch this process slowly moving out. At this point, it's taken since 1983 to get to 50%. With some of the communications things that I mentioned earlier, especially that global satellite Viasat thing and others, I'm hoping that we will accelerate rather than incrementally succeed. So maybe by 2020 we will have 70% or 75% of the world's population online. The other thing which has really helped a lot, thank you very much, Marty, is the mobile phone. And specifically, of course, the smartphone. And once that thing came along in 2007, isn't it hard to believe that it's only 10 years ago? And we are completely and totally addicted to this stuff. But that thing extended access to the internet in a very dramatic way. And so that too has helped speed up the ability of people to use the system. So that's really why I still am at it, because there's still a lot of work to do. Okay, we have one more back there.
There's just one, and then
yeah, I was just going to ask if one of the stated goals here was to figure out how to get you to move to San Diego and be our evangelist. And I just want to find out if we were successful.
No, I've lived in the Washington area for 41 years now. I grew up in California, 8 years in the Bay Area, and 22 years in LA. I'm a Valley boy from Van Nuys. But we really love Washington. However, I can tell you that Pradeep Khosla, who's the chancellor at UC San Diego, has been twisting my arm pretty hard. And I've been on Larry's Cal IT2 advisory board for pretty much all of its existence. I'm super attracted to this place, maybe not to move here, but I've been looking forward to having excuses to show up.
And there will now be the presentation of voluminous thanks.
I guess I can take this off now because you're not. I'm back online. Good.
You're back online.
Yes.
Dr. Cerf, thank you so much. That was a fascinating program. All of us learned so much. Thank you for coming to visit us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And thank you for all the sponsors and all the tremendous hard work that went into this excellent program.